You know, folks, we've been going steady for a little bit now, and I think it's time that I reveal something to you all. I'm a Sonic fan.
Snooping as usual, I see.
Alright, maybe it's not that big of a deal, but how would you look your family in the eyes and say you worship at the feet of this thing? But being in this fan base has its perks, like never having to deal with that pesky sex thing I keep hearing about. Once you're in, kid, and you end up seeing a lot. From the ups and downs, to the ups and way downs, to the ups and really way downs. But I love this little blue freak regardless. And I'd be letting down my inner child if I got off this ride now. I mean, look at how long this video is. You think I have anything left to lose? Having absolutely lived and breathed Sonic games non-stop, you could have knocked over my little 8-year-old self with a feather when I learned that not only could I enjoy seeing my Hedgehog hero running around on my gaming console, but there also existed cartoon versions of him I could watch in my viewing pleasure. And by pleasure, I mean if I had the DVD or was willing to wake up at 7 a.m. to watch the reruns. Boy did I, and boy was I. With that in mind, I wanted to revisit the delight I felt learning of and getting to watch these shows by talking about each of them today. It shouldn't be too hard. How many can there really be? 1 or 2? 3? 4? 5? Okay, so there's 6 of these motherfuckers, but you know what? I made a blind commitment to cover all the Sonic cartoons today. That means going over each of their histories, their individual casts, and how they may have helped shape the series in little ways to be the petri dish of wildly varying quality we know it as today. Gotta give it to me, right? Who else would be willing to make a video about this topic? Just wait until you see me do it. Starting us off was the aptly named Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, with production helmed by Deke Animation City, an entertainment company that was everywhere in the 80s and 90s, mostly known for daring kids around the world to not bust out laughing at their name.
Deke.
If you think that's cruel, look at what they had written on their building. Adventures really didn't have much to work with in terms of a structured mythos. With the pilot releasing in August of 1992 and the series following in September of 93, the franchise would only be 2 games in by the time the show premiered. Acting as the trailblazer of sorts for all future Sonic shows, there was a lot that the production had to come up with on their own, such as a cohesive look for the world, personalities for the main cast, and perhaps the most distinguishable of all, the voices. Okay, looking at this character in the games, what would you think he'd sound like? Maybe something with a high-pitched, energized feeling to it? Or they could go another way and give him a rad, scratchy, rock star kind of tone. Or maybe they'll go with Urkel. Yeah, it was Jaleel White, most known for his portrayal as Steve Urkel on Family Matters, who would be tapped to voice the Blue Hedgehog. A decision that, to this day, still feels weird to say out loud. And it's not that Jaleel did an awful job or anything, but if I was making the creative decisions back then, I'm not sure I would have looked at this thing running around and thought, hey, you know, I'm getting an overalls vibe. Despite the oddness of this casting, I always felt White gave a passable performance. He's not my favorite Sonic voice, but he does bring a sort of mischievous, rascally energy that I think suited the type of show they were looking for at the time. Also being given an animated facelift would be our villain, Dr. Ivo Robotnik, who would receive a more sinister-looking redesign, featuring a distinctive pair of black and red eyes, coupled with a more angular shape to his head, though other parts of him would be a bit rounded out. Voiced by Jim Cummings in the pilot, the Doctor would eventually be brought to life by another interesting choice, English musician and voice actor Long John Baldry. I always got the impression Baldry was having a ton of fun in this role, delivering Robotnik's lines in a booming, regal-like way, rolling all of his R's and cranking the pomposity up to 11.
Why, that little impudent pipsqueak of a blue baboon? If he wants a fight, that's just what he'll get.
The show would take place on Sonic's home planet of Mobius, a nonsensically technicolor wasteland of abstract backgrounds and over-the-top bouncy music that wouldn't be out of place at any carnival. For the plot, one couldn't be blamed for drawing the most comparisons to Looney Tunes, with episodes usually revolving around Robotnik and his bumbling lackeys Scratch and Grounder being repeatedly foiled by the likes of Sonic and Tails, closely following the blueprints of the classic Wile E. Coyote shorts. I get why this was done, being a tried-and-true formula that had been proven to work for young audiences, but by the early 90s, this format had long felt played out. Not helping was the fact that there really isn't anything interesting or creative being done here with our concept, presenting the pacing and structure of an old Warner Brothers cartoon without doing much more than giving it a Sonic coat of paint. Yeah, Sonic is fast like he is in the games, but other than that, what's present here to make this show feel like a natural extension of the brand? That being said, there isn't anything particularly bad for kids here, just a bit outdated and out of touch. Like these infamous Sonic Says segments that pop up at the end of episodes where Sonic teaches the kids out there ham-fisted cautionary tips like looking both ways before crossing the street and the like. These were definitely a product of the regulations on children's programming at the time, requiring stricter focus on educational lessons being included in cartoons. And while I feel these shorts had their heart in the right place, it's just difficult to take them seriously in retrospect when they're hosted by this nasally do-gooder.
If you think it's smart to climb in a dryer, you're really all wet.
A total of 65 episodes were produced for the cartoon's first and only season, and while a second was planned by Deke, they ultimately decided to instead shift their focus to their other Sonic cartoon airing at the same time. Also premiering in September of '93 was our next show, plainly called Sonic the Hedgehog, or colloquially as Sonic SatAM, being a shorthand for Saturday AM, aka Saturday morning. Oh, now I get it. It is a bit odd that Deke decided to double dip in the Sonic craze by pushing out two of these cartoons on top of each other, but tonally they couldn't be more different. One takes a down-to-earth, gritty, action-oriented approach, and the other...
Help! I've fallen, and I can't get up!
Who can say which one's better, you know? Entertainment's subjective and all. We have to take the good with the... Well, this one's better. This one's a lot better. SatAM followed the Hedgehog, once again voiced by Jaleel White, as he battled through a war-torn planet Mobius, a now dictatorship controlled by Dr. Robotnik, voiced officially this time by Jim Cummings, who would bring a much more sinister and threatening edge to the role.
I hoped the Great Hedgehog would be more of a challenge. You disappoint me.
Though many assume the show owes its identity wholesale to the long-running Sonic comics by Archie that were beginning around the same time, it actually was kind of the other way around, with the darker tone introduced by the show later influencing the direction of the books, though what was lifted from the comics would be an all-new cast that fans of the games wouldn't recognize if they hadn't previously picked up a few issues. Can you imagine how lame those fans must have looked? There was, of course, Tails, the kid's sidekick, but now an entire team was present, all unifying against the looming threat of Robotnik's conquest to roboticize the entire planet. Included on this roster would be Princess Sally Acorn, the no-nonsense leader of the group and heir to the usurped throne, as well as Sonic's constant foil. The will they won't they tension was insane. You just had to be there. Rotor, the team brainiac and inventor, Bunny Rabbot, a half-roboticized Southern Belle fighting machine, and Antoine, a cowardly French royal guard of the princess who's really clumsy and honestly just kinda sucks. Together, the Freedom Fighters operated out of the village of Knothole, organizing their plans of attack against the Robotnik Empire. This show was pretty kick-ass for the time, being all about fighting, infiltration, mystery, deceit. There was a lot going on. Makes sense why even still today there's fan projects aiming to continue the story with a groundswell of support surrounding them. It's cool to see how much of an impact it had, despite only having 2 seasons, totaling 26 episodes and wrapping up with a slight cliffhanger in the finale in December of '94. The comics would continue for decades into vastly different directions. If you know, you know. But I find the interpretation of the cast here to be the most suiting of the Sonic brand, despite most of them never making an appearance in the games, outside of a brief cameo in Sonic Spinball and a proposed tie-in game that never got past the planning stages. It feels like this world is a natural fit for Sonic's personality too, which is still that of a cocky, well-meaning goofball. However, now it's in stark contrast with his setting, making it feel like his wisecracks are more of a conscious means of raising morale rather than making him feel like a one-note diet roadrunner. But all in all, this show is a fun and standout venture for the series that feels well deserving of its passionate fanbase. Though pretty polar opposites, these two sister shows would be linked in several different ways, such as syndication deals and network negotiations for one directly impacting the other. In 1996, there was even a Christmas special produced in the style of Adventures where Princess Sally from the SatAM series would briefly appear, sporting a different color scheme. I'm not sure if this was an attempt to somehow combine the continuity of both shows into one, but I can't imagine that would have gone very far. It would be a few years later until Deke would strike that iron a third time in 1999, and... okay, where do I start here? Sonic Underground sees the Hedgehog now as one of 3 triplets, all born to a royal family. Their mother, the Queen of Mobius, was forced to separate from them while they were still infants when Dr. Robotnik took over the kingdom. Though not all hope is lost, a sage named the Oracle of Delphius, yeah, we're doing this, tells the children that their prophecy is to reunite with their mother and defeat Robotnik. The Oracle also grants the triplets each their own powerful medallion that seconds as a musical instrument because, yep, they're also in a band called Sonic Underground, which means, yep, there's songs. As you can imagine, this show went on to become the black sheep of the Sonic cartoons, considering it just seems interested in doing its own thing, in spite of what anybody wanted to see. Returning for the third and final time would be Jaleel White as Sonic, but now he'd be pulling triple duty as he was brought on to voice all three siblings, including Sonic's brother and sister, Manic and Sonia. I don't know if this was a creative decision or just done to keep casting budgets down, but it is funny to watch what's clearly White talking to himself in three slightly different vocal tones.
Yeah, remember, cool. No problemo.
Morning, guys!
The main cast would have designated actors for their singing voices as well whenever they broke out into song, but come on guys, why stop there? I'm sure Jaleel wouldn't have minded pulling that off too. Robotnik would be once again recast, now played by veteran voice actor Gary Chalk, taking the character a few steps closer to the expressiveness of Adventure's interpretation while still carrying the demeanor of SatAM. Tonally, the show would follow suit, characters and dialogue being a touch more childish, but the settings and plots still presenting themselves in a darker atmosphere. It was an attempt to capture what worked about both previous shows, but rather than become as successful an amalgamation as they may have hoped, the show was doomed from the start by some pretty crucial missteps. Perhaps the most obvious to the casual viewer would be a chronic inability to keep the characters on model, with clips from the show becoming infamous online for showcasing just how many basic animation mistakes could be made in a span of a few seconds. I was always put in a state of slight unease during the opening too, when the hedgehogs would all appear to have such wide-open, inexpressive eyes, though was lulled back in by the absolutely rocking theme song. Best song in the show by far, and an absolute earworm. It just seems like a lot for fans to take in up front, with this new continuity existing solely on its own, not pulling from any supplemental material. We're pretty distant from the games at this point, making Sonic royalty, having two siblings no one's ever heard of before, and the fact that they're all part of a cliched pop rock 90s band with accompanying music video filters that felt a decade behind even back when it aired. It's a hard sell to try to get anyone to take this one seriously, and I'd be lying if I said I couldn't see why. Sonic being part of a band doesn't exactly scream ill-fitting for the character, especially since early concepts for the games would see him doing just that. But I think there just wasn't enough recognizable elements here to draw in existing fans, while also not having enough substance to garner new ones. Oh well, at least we got that theme song. Making it about 40 episodes in its one-season run, Sonic Underground would pitter out into obscurity around the turn of the new millennium, with Sega quietly pretending that this never happened. As for Manic and Sonia, they'd never make another appearance. Well, at least on purpose, that is. Sonia would actually pop up years later in the 2010 game Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing, where on the casino track, art of her was used accidentally instead of Amy Rose. After finding out their mistake, the game was patched by the developers to replace the art with the intended image. But the original mistake still remains in the Wii version, as well as the low-resolution settings of the PC port. What makes this even funnier is that the art used for Sonia isn't even official, and actually was taken from DeviantArt user Art by Rihanna. So I guess this counts as having a legacy. Things were starting to change for Sonic around this time, introducing a new look for the characters to replace their more rounded classic designs, and an aesthetic of high-octane, electric guitar-accompanied action was on the horizon. With the games now adopting new identities, it was time that the shows representing the brand do the same. It wouldn't be until 2003 that the next Sonic cartoon would be released, this time produced by Japanese studio TMS Entertainment, or Tokyo Movie Shinsha. Yeah, Sonic was going anime rather than Western produced, something that seemed to work decently well for other popular 90s gaming brands, so the precedent was set. With all that in place, Sonic X would release on Fox Kids through the 4Kids Entertainment block, being my and many other fans' first experience with the idea of taking this and putting it on this. Acting as the breath of fresh air I feel the franchise needed in the animation front, there's a lot of new elements introduced in X, some for better and some for worse. The show would see Sonic and friends being accidentally transported to Earth from their homeworld, having to become accustomed to the changes in environment to find where they belong, all while stopping Dr. Robotnik, now referred to full-time as Dr. Eggman. Things have become a lot more homogenized with the look and feel of the games, with X being populated by recognizable characters that had yet to actually be represented through the medium, like Amy Rose, Cream the Rabbit, Shadow, Rouge, Team Chaotix, Chris Thorndike. Ah, damn, sorry, that's my anime alarm going off. The levels in here are getting a bit unsafe. Chris was an original creation for the show, acting as an audience surrogate along with his family, being the ones to discover and take care of Sonic and friends when they first arrived on Earth. The Thorndikes would develop the closest bond to these superpowered anthropomorphic creatures, all while being about as interesting as a box of dryer sheets. These human characters, Chris especially, were the recipients of the most hate from fans of the show, and I can't say I disagree. I don't find them as enraging as some out there, but if you're a kid who's into Sonic, the last thing you want to see is the life and times of a whiny, confused 12-year-old who doesn't do much other than talk about how cool the characters are that you actually want to watch. It was just a little too traditional early 2000s anime for me. Sorry, I gotta change the subject. All new voices were in order for the leads, eventually being labeled within the fan base as the 4Kids cast, who would become mainstays for the years that followed in the franchise's games as well. This would include Jason Griffith as Sonic, who I felt may have started off a bit on the hokey side, but eventually found a pretty solid delivery, going on to become my personal favorite voice for the Hedgehog.
Kids, don't use Formula One race cars to chase hedgehogs.
Just enough of that playful nasally sound with a bit more of a range, being able to pull off some serious moments when necessary. Despite it being well over a decade since he's held the role, Griffith's performance is always my mental go-to when I think of the voice of modern Sonic. Though he wouldn't be the only big get. Dr. Eggman would be portrayed for the first time by Mike Pollock, who is the only one of the 4Kids cast to still be portraying his character by popular demand. His loud yet gravelly inflection perfectly suiting both the goofy and intimidating sides of the Doctor, delivering lines that would often be the most entertaining parts of the show.
How did you pass security?
I pretended I was a bar of soap and gave them all the slip.
I've always considered Pollock's Eggman to be akin to Mark Hamill's Joker. Sure, other people could and have played the role just fine, but when it comes down to it, we've already found the best man for the job. I just wish I could extend the same praise for the rest of the new cast. Some are just fine and pull off the roles without much of a hitch, but in true anime fashion, there's more than our fair share of gratingly high-pitched, over-the-top performances that have aged about as well as...
We are Sonic Underground.
Actually, I guess I've seen worse. Another notable aspect of the show would be the intrusive censorship done by 4Kids to appease Western FCC regulations. Being produced in Japan, there were certain lines, references, and story elements changed for the English dub that ranged from harmless to absolute butchery. Plotlines such as certain characters being killed or making a self-sacrifice would be changed altogether, with lazy, confusing edits breaking the impact of the scene in half. Because of these issues, I'd say anyone out there who may be interested in checking out Sonic X should try the subtitled version instead to get the uncensored intended version of these episodes. These nitpicks aside, Sonic X was a pretty big success, with 3 seasons and 78 episodes total, as well as spawning a lot of merchandise sales on top of it. There would even be plots from the games adapted for the cartoon, which I'm surprised took them 4 shows in to attempt in any way. A flashy, exciting, only somewhat messy joyride that excited many a young fan, myself included. And a worthwhile watch if you can handle a dash of the old weeaboo cringe. The year was now 2005. Sonic X was not to be renewed for another season, and thus the blue blur would enter the longest span of time yet between cartoons. It would be a whopping 9 years before the next attempt would be produced for Cartoon Network by We Do Productions and Technicolor Animation. Having had quite the rocky road throughout the mid to late 2000s, reviews were on the upswing for Sonic's early 2010 game releases, and rumors began to pop up that Sega would be planning a complete revamp of the franchise. A few months later, it would be revealed that the rumors were true, and that Sonic Boom would be the name of the new spin-off universe that seemed pretty much identical to the existing universe. It was still Sonic and Friends vs. Dr. Eggman, but now they all had athletic tape wrapped around their arms and legs. Thus, the reputation of the franchise was once again saved. The 2 major pillars of this new continuity would be both the upcoming game and cartoon series. The former, Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric for the Wii U, would be released in November of 2014 as a broken, unfinished mess, receiving overwhelmingly negative reviews for its abysmal frame rate, constant glitches, and tedious gameplay. And thus, the reputation for the franchise was once again ruined. This just left the cartoon series released alongside the major bomb to pick up the pieces, and despite all signs pointing to this being a blistering failure as well, Sonic Boom the show would actually be very well received by both fans and critics. We're back to basics with our plot this time. Our heroes, Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, and newcomer Styx are all living on Seaside Island, protecting their town from the recurring attacks by Dr. Eggman. There's a lot stronger of a focus on comedy, with Boom having a more episodic, lighthearted narrative. Unlike its predecessors, the humor would be a bit matured, having a cynical edge to it that I think was very well suited to this new setup.
I can't be swimming around with a bunch of 5-year-olds. They can be so cruel when they sense weakness.
That's why on the first day, you have to beat up the biggest one in the yard.
Knuckles, that's prison.
Only if you let it be.
That's Roger Craig Smith as Sonic, who's been voicing the character since 2010, along with the new actors for Tails, Knuckles, and Amy. I remember being really put off by his deeper Nickelodeon announcer inflection when the switch first took place, but his performance in this show was what finally won me over. He's able to stretch his comedic legs and offer some legitimately good timing and delivery with his more snarky and egotistical version of the character. The same can be said for the returning Mike Pollock as Dr. Eggman, who I already was a fan of, but watching him take the role into more outlandish and comedic scenarios with the same amount of gusto that he says anything else with was certainly a treat.
All right, it was a trick. I was gonna ambush you, and you didn't even have the decency to show up. That's really rude, Sonic.
Styx the Badger isn't too bad either. Being created for the new series, she actually fits in among the long-running cast very naturally. I thought it was a bit of a loss that she only exists inside the Boom continuity, but considering the recent efforts in Sonic Frontiers to make everything canon, maybe her popping up again in the future isn't as unlikely as I thought. Good luck making any sense out of that. Out of all these shows so far, I feel I had the most fun revisiting Boom. By the time it was originally airing, I was aging out of watching cartoons, a development I've clearly regressed on, so I didn't really have a chance to see what it was all about outside of a few clips. That, and it had some pretty sour time slots on the network, airing at the crack of dawn most days, and eventually being banished to Boomerang, Cartoon Network's less popular side channel where it faded into obscurity. There's enough recognizable elements here to make longtime fans feel at home, while not being too alienating for new audiences to hop along for the ride. There's some cheeky references to the games too for those with a keen eye for detail. Even Shadow eventually makes an appearance here, which is a pretty big deal since he's only the second most popular character in the whole canon. I'm glad I got the chance to sit down and watch Boom through making this video because it's a pretty great time. Not every joke lands, of course. There are some groaners in there, as well as the animation at points looking a little on the stiff side, but there's also plenty of clever, self-aware, and fourth wall breaking moments to tip the scales. It demonstrates an awareness on how to handle fan service without owing its entire identity to feeling it needs to please. And after seeing Sega fumble the ball on this rebranding in every other aspect, it's a relief to see that something worthwhile came from it all. 104 episodes would be produced in its 2-season run, coming to a close in November of 2017. And though Sonic Boom as a whole may be remembered as an embarrassingly ill-planned blunder, at least there's something to be said for the cartoon. Was it worth the damage to the public image of the brand? Yeah, nah, let's move on. Our next and final show we'll be looking at is Sonic Prime, premiering in December of 2022 and currently on its 2nd season. Look at me, talking about something relevant for once. Soak it in now before I drop that 2-hour-long video essay on the cultural significance of cat scratch. Prime currently streams on Netflix, produced by Netflix Animation and Wild Brain Studios, as well as Man of Action Entertainment, a company some might recognize from their popular show Ben 10 and its follow-ups. Nudging us back into a more story-driven direction, Prime has our characters living peacefully in Green Hill, up until Sonic irresponsibly shatters a reality-shifting prism during one of his fights with Eggman, causing his world and friends to all be displaced in a multiverse of realities referred to as the Shatterverse. Sonic now has to own up to his mistake, traveling through different realities, meeting alternate versions of his friends, and saving all of the worlds from the threat of Eggman and his multi-dimensional counterparts. All the usual faces are here as you'd expect. Tails, Knuckles, Amy. Rouge has been made part of the main cast now, as well as Big the Cat having a recurring role. I think enough time has passed now that this guy's come back around to being at least ironically enjoyable, so it's all good. The voice actors have been changed once again, picking up the long-dormant tradition of having an entirely separate cast handpicked specifically for the show itself. Voice actor Brian Drummond, known for his work as characters like Vegeta from Dragon Ball Z, would pick up the baton as Dr. Eggman, as well as a few of his cross-dimensional alterations. With Drummond's history, it's no surprise he delivers a pretty solid performance, though the big talking point for many would be the introduction of Sonic's new actor, Devin Mack. There seems to be a lot of pressure involved in representing a popular character, but luckily I think Mack delivers just fine. He has a slightly more childish and impatient delivery, which I could see how some might find annoying, though it isn't his fault for how the character's written, he's just doing his job. And as a self-professed lifelong Sonic fan, he seems to be ecstatic at the opportunity, so good for him. I was actually pretty impressed with the voice talents here. A lot of the roles being double casted, with a plot revolving around multiple versions of the same characters across different dimensions. There's some good range in performances here that help the cohesion of the story stay tight and convincing. And while I am selfishly missing my Mike Pollock Eggman, it's pretty clear to see that this is the most consistent a cast has ever been for a Sonic cartoon. That's a compliment I can extend to the visuals as well. Something like Sonic Boom wasn't necessarily bad looking, just a bit flat in certain places. Though here, with the exception of maybe some odd lighting choices once in a while, I think things have really smoothed out. There's a lot of expressive squash and stretch to the character movements that go a long way to making the art style feel traditional and modern at the same time. Sure, there are things like Sonic's legs going into a classic figure 8 when he's running like the old days, but it's all in service to the overall aesthetic. The writing isn't as cynical anymore. There's a good mix of lighthearted humor, along with more quiet moments to allow characters to breathe and react to their surroundings. Though a lot of people online have criticized this aspect, particularly its depiction of Sonic being a bit too irresponsible, and the fact that series lore goes largely ignored, causing some contradictions to the games. But I really can't get behind either of these critiques. It's a new universe. There doesn't need to be any strict rulebook for what can and can't happen. There's no reason to hold a show made for 8 to 12-year-olds in such high regard, and yes, I know how stupid that sounds coming from me. Everything will be okay if it doesn't exactly suit our personal tastes, as long as the product itself comes together in its own right. For what it is, I see a lot of good stuff for young kids here in Sonic Prime. There's fun action, recognizable characters, a legitimate threat, and compelling enough story to make it feel like a whole package. And if this were the Sonic show to continue for a while and catch fire with young audiences, I think I'd be just fine with it. The more actually well-produced products for this franchise, the better. There's still a lot of rectifying to do on that front. Well, we're all caught up. I know I just scratched the surface of Sonic's history with animation by not talking about stuff like the recent movies, the promotional shorts coinciding with game releases, cameos in other shows, and, oh, who could forget the Japanese Sonic OVA from the 90s? Though that's a can of worms that might need to wait for its own video.
Strange, isn't it?
Despite this, I think each of these shows complement one another enough to be appropriately placed in their own category. All eras of the franchise are represented, from the classic days to modern to everything in between. What one falls short on for some might be rectified in another, or vice versa, making them an interestingly diverse catalog to revisit. One that's poised to continue growing with the announced Knuckles miniseries planned for release sometime later this year. I'm glad I got the opportunity to check out all these shows, getting to see the effects of modern trends provide their own unique shape to each time they went back up to bat, providing a retrospective timeline of the Hedgehog's history not only in cartoons, but as a franchise altogether. And I'm confident in saying I'll still be around for whatever it is they might come up with next. Even if it's a show about Sonic and Big sharing a studio apartment while trying to start a professional bowling league. Actually, with this franchise, that's not outside the realm of possibility. Yeah, you know what? Maybe I do want off this ride after all. I need some actual brand competency. I'm gonna go cleanse my palate with the Donkey Kong cartoon.